Today, we're breaking down the official White House press briefing that first announced Operation Epic Fury, a massive military operation against Iran. We're going to go through the administration's story step by step, exactly how they presented it to the world.
Right out of the gate, the briefing opened with this. Talk about setting a tone. From the very first sentence, you knew this wasn't just a standard update, it was a declaration of dominance.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what was actually said. We're going to look at the White House's justification for the operation, what they said their military goals were, and the immediate consequences they shared with the public.
First up, the why. How did the administration justify this? Well, their argument wasn't really about one single event. Instead, they painted a picture of nearly half a century of Iranian aggression.
The press secretary framed this whole operation as a response to decades of hostility. She pointed to these specific painful moments in history, the hostage crisis, the Beirut bombing, the casualties in Iraq, as part of what she called Iran's blood-soaked record. The message was clear. This wasn't a choice, it was an inevitability.
And a huge part of the justification was drawing a sharp line between the past and the present. Previous administrations, they were portrayed as weak, caught up in endless appeasement. But President Trump, they argued, was a man of action, finally holding Iran accountable.
But before getting to the military details, the White House made a point to say, hey, we tried talking first. They laid out what they called generous and unprecedented offers, lifting sanctions, providing nuclear fuel, all things they claim Iran rejected. For the administration, this was the final proof that Iran chose a path of conflict over peace.
Okay, so that's the why. Now for the what. The briefing then shifted from the backstory to the operation itself, laying out the specific goals of Epic Fury and, more importantly, the numbers they used to declare it a resounding success.
These were the 4 big objectives. And this is where the briefing really pivoted from just talking about strategy to dropping some pretty serious statistics to show how they were meeting these goals.
The first number they threw out was just huge, designed to show the sheer scale of this attack. Over 2,000 targets. To put that in perspective, they said that was nearly double the intensity of the shock and awe campaign back in 2003, just in the first 24 hours.
And then came this absolutely stunning claim. The White House announced that 49 senior leaders, including the Supreme Leader, had been eliminated. In their own words from the podium, this was good for America.
To check the box on that second objective, taking out the Navy, the White House reported that over 20 Iranian ships had been sunk. They went on to claim there were no Iranian naval vessels left operating in the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman.
They used this chart to really drive the point home. The argument here was pretty simple. As U.S. military strikes continued, Iran's ability to fire back was collapsing, with their missile launches supposedly down by 86%.
So, you have these major military claims, but what about the fallout from all this? The briefing then shifted to address the immediate impact, the very real consequences for people on the ground and for the global economy.
A huge point of emphasis for the administration was its evacuation efforts. They reported that 17,500 Americans had been brought home safely, framing it as a top priority to protect citizens abroad.
Now, when reporters pressed them on whether citizens were warned in time, the press secretary rattled off a list of advisories going back months. The administration's defense was basically, look, the State Department was shouting from the rooftops about the dangers.
The briefing also acknowledged the human cost for the U.S. military. The press secretary offered condolences to the families of the 6 service members who had been killed, and she announced that the president would attend their dignified transfer.
And what about the economy, specifically oil prices? To calm those fears, the administration laid out a plan. They would offer political risk insurance, which is basically the government covering cargo ships against war-related losses, and even use the Navy to escort oil tankers if needed. The overall message was that the U.S. economy was strong enough to handle it. But even with all those detailed claims of success, the briefing left some really big questions hanging in the air, especially about the long-term plan. And that brings us to the very uncertain aftermath.
Whenever reporters tried to pin them down on what happens next, the press secretary kept coming back to this theme of resolve. The message was that this is what happens when a president means what he says and doesn't bluff.
And all of this led reporters to ask the million-dollar question. With the Supreme Leader supposedly gone, what was the actual end goal? Was this about regime change?
So, the official answer? Well, they very carefully avoided using the words regime change. Instead, they just repeated the 4 military goals. But then, they followed it up with that comment about taking out a terrorist, which, strongly implied that was exactly the outcome they wanted.
And that's pretty much where the briefing ended.
The administration painted this picture of a decisive, justified, and successful military operation. But by sidestepping that fundamental question of the political endgame, it leaves us all wondering, once the smoke clears, what does victory actually look like?